We will go ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. This is Bruce Black, horticulture educator with University of Illinois Extension, coming to you again from Dixon for Carroll-Lee and Whiteside counties. We are excited to be doing our 7th presentation of the Growing Horticulture in Northwest Illinois presentation. And today we're joined with another guest to help us present, and that is Grant McCarty. He is the local foods and small farms educator up in Joe Davies, Winnebago, and Stevenson County. So he will be joining us for the second part of today's presentations. Grant is going to be doing the diseases and insects, which are always popular questions for the growing season. Just like with presentations in the past, as well as last week, we will do questions at the end of mine. But if we get a lot of questions, we might table some of those to the end, just so that we can respect everybody's time today and make sure that we get out about noon. So with that, I'm going to turn off my video for now, and we'll get started with today's presentation. All right, so again, this is part 2 of the Northern Berry School, and we are going to continue our conversation on management from last week. And last week we got through strawberries before we had to leave for last week. So today we are going to continue our discussion on management strategies, starting with blueberries. If you're looking at the handout, this should be the 14th slide of the presentation. So if you have the handout from last week or the 6th slide that I sent out, this will be slide number 14 that we start with. And blueberries have become one of those popular crops, as Candace mentioned last week, that everybody wants to grow because blueberries are one of those delicious summer treats, but they, like all of our berries, have a very short shelf life. There are multiple types of blueberries that can be grown, and unfortunately for us, we don't have the natural soil conditions where we can just stick them in the ground and they'll grow. So for our blueberries, we have to do a lot of that prep and management that Candace mentioned last week to modify our soil or modify our container in order to be able to grow. So starting off with pruning and training for our blueberries, and there is no trellising that is required for blueberries. Blueberries grow as a bush. And so as long as we prune them well and we continue that renewal pruning, which we'll talk about in a little bit, then we can have that natural structure that we look for. Irrigation or watering of blueberries, very similar to our strawberries. Drip irrigation is recommended, just so that we're limiting the amount of splashback up from the soil. But as compared to our strawberries and our raspberries, our blueberries can tolerate a sprinkler type irrigation system. These blueberry bushes can last about 60 years if they're properly maintained and they're properly cared for in the right site. So they are built with a little bit more sturdiness that we would see very similar to a landscape bush. The roots of our blueberries go less than 18 inches of the soil, so they're not a well-rooted, they're a shallow, fibrous rooted plant, which means the water that we provide needs to stay in that 18 inches for it to pull up. The other thing to mention about blueberries is a lot of our blueberries are planted on what we call a berm, which is just a raised hill. And this allows the blueberries so that they don't retain or don't sit in ponds of water. We build them up so that the water runs off but soaks into the soil. So with our blueberries, one of the things is, how do I know if I've given it too much water? How do I know if I haven't given it enough water? Well, the things that you don't want to see are reddened foliage, wilting, browning of the leaf margins, thin or weak shoots, early defoliation, or decreased fruit set. Now, I would love to tell you that these happen only when it's overwatered or when it's underwatered, but for blueberries, they happen for both overwatering and underwatering. So if you see any of these, you'll have to think about your site conditions, the weather patterns we've been having, and then that'll help determine if it's been overwatered or underwatered. The reason why I spend a little bit more time on watering here as compared to our other crops that we talk about is because it's been scientifically researched that if you have consistent and well-watered blueberries, you actually get 18% larger fruits than if you have an inconsistent water schedule. And this is huge because fruit is packaged water. So if we think of the strawberries, the blueberries, the blackberries and raspberries, those are about 87% or more water. And with that, that increase in water is going to have those larger, juicier, more flavorful berries that we look for. Fertilization, Candace mentioned this last week, so I'm just going to refresh it. 4 weeks after planting, you want to apply 1 ounce of ammonium sulfate in a circular band around the base of the plant. This helps provide the nitrogen that is needed for blueberry production, as well as helps to maintain the acidity that we need for blueberries to be able to take up enough iron. As with last week, we talked about how every year you need to increase until you reach 8 ounces of fertilizer, and that is what you give them. So with the ammonium sulfate, the first year you'll give 1 ounce, and then the next year you'll give 2, 3, all the way up to 8 ounces. And Cindy, I just seen your question pop up. So it is up to 60 years. So there have been studies done in Illinois at one of our research farms where the blueberries have been maintained, watered constantly, fertilized on a yearly basis, and they're still going strong. And it's been 60 some years that they've been lasting. So jumping to pruning, with our blueberries, they will not, well, they will, but we don't want them to produce fruit the first 2 years. So the first 2 years, we're going to prune off or pick off those flower buds and any weak or diseased growth to leave the blueberry in a vegetative growth state. The reason why we are going to do this is because we want those first 2 years for that plant to really establish itself, develop a good root system, because it can last those decades long. Fruit is going to be produced on year 2 to 4 year-old canes. So when we talked last week, we talked about how blueberries, raspberries, and blackberries produce canes. And this is just the growth that comes out from the underground structure. So our goal when we prune our blueberries is to manage the plants so they're primarily made up of bearing age wood, which means that fruiting wood. We're going to be pruning our blueberries in late winter. So this is about the same time that you prune your apple trees. This can be done in between November and March, depending on the weather and what your pruning schedule is. For plants that have 5-year-old wood on it, we're going to remove those completely down to the soil. So on year 5, after they've fruited, we're going to remove the 5-year canes back down to the ground. And then those new canes that came up that year will overwinter and become fruiting canes for next year. When we talk about pruning our berries, it's going to depend on your management style, on how you want to take an approach to this. For our blueberries, we're going to be managing 5-year-old wood. So one of the things that growers will do is have 5 rotating colors of either string or zip ties that they will put on during year 1. So let's say for year 1, I'm going to use yellow. I can write that down in my maintenance journal that year 2020, first year wood is marked with yellow. Those overwinter and go through the cycle. Then next year for the 2021 wood, I would make them green. And so I start developing a color code system so that I know that what I need to manage or what I need to prune for that upcoming year. So after we get to 2025, at the end of that growing season, I will know by looking in my notebook that all of the yellow pieces that are left are year 5 wood. I need to remove those. And then starting with 2026, I can reuse that yellow color again as my year 1 color code. The other thing people will do is if they do put a trellis through, they will, and they don't have to because of the management or the growth habit of it, but if they do put some kind of trellis or support system, they might tie it to a specific side. Now, it's not one that's common or that I really recommend. It's going to be more in your management style. I prefer the color code just because it's an easy visual appeal for me. Um, and for maintenance, we only need to think about winter protection for our blueberries when we get down into those really, really cold temperatures that we can get in Northwest Illinois. So winter injury on blueberries happens at -25 to -30. So if you think back the past couple of winters, when we got into that polar vortex, we came pretty close to the temperatures that we would have for needing to provide some winter protection. Now, as you can see from this picture, these are what blueberry bushes will look like. So they do get, depending on their stage, I would say these are probably 6, maybe 7 feet tall. And so covering each individual bush might not be practical, but we can use some strategies of planting windbreaks to help cut down on those northwest winter winds, as well as providing some of those insulated row covers that we've talked about before, just to help hold in some of that heat. For weed control, as Candace mentioned, good site preparation prior to planting is going to really help. It really does cut down on the work that you do in years following if you spend that extra time to really prepare the site before you start. So you want to eradicate any perennial and annual weeds that you might have at your planting. Because our blueberries are going to be grown on berms, in between our rows, we can plant some ground covers to help build up that soil, build in the nutrition, as well as provide a good cover for those rows. To help with any persistent weeds that we have, we can use herbicide options to help eliminate some of those difficult to control weeds that we might have. And you can use both organic and non-organic chemical options. Cultivation is also going to be one of your friends, going in and manually taking care of those weeds, pulling them out. Again, similar to our strawberries, for our perennial weeds, you have to identify them before you treat them, because with perennial weeds, you need to know which stage of the weed is going to be most vulnerable to control. So it might be in some of our perennial weeds, when they're in their vegetative state, that they are going to be most vulnerable. Others might be more vulnerable when later in the season, when they're getting ready to flower. And then annual weeds can be controlled with pre-emergence or hand harvesting as we go through the season. All right, so harvesting. This is going to be mainly a hand harvest crop, because as you can see from the picture down here, blueberries do not ripen all at the same time. They ripen individually. So if you harvest some of these more purple purple blueberries, excuse me, they are going to not be fully sweetened. The other reason why we promote hand harvesting of blueberries is if you try to do mechanical harvesting, it really does reduce the shelf storage of the blueberries because blueberries are very thin-skinned and very susceptible to bruising. So ideally, you want to pick your fruit, cool it, size it if you are going to sell it, so grate it, and then refrigerate it down to 32 to 37 degrees, all within an hour of harvest. Now, for backyard operations, you're going to want to pick your produce during the cooler times of the day. So this could be early morning, cloudy days, or evening, afternoon time. Then once it's picked, you want to cool it down to refrigerator temperatures as quickly as possible to help prolong that shelf life. Oops, went the wrong way. So we'll want to store them as close to 32 degrees as possible for the longest shelf life. As with our strawberries, the higher the temperature, the shorter the shelf life. So most of our temperatures for our refrigerators are going to be between 35 to 40 degrees, depending on how cold you keep your refrigerator. So this is going to reduce the 2 weeks that is on the screen. Usually you're looking at maybe a week to week and a half with the temperatures. The other thing that we have to think about is the exposure to other fruits that we store our blueberries with. So you don't want to store your blueberries with apples, peaches, pears, melons, grapes, any of those ethylene producing fruits. So ethylene is the ripening hormone that is given off in a gaseous state by fruits. It's a naturally producing hormone, and as the fruit ripens, there are some that produce ethylene, and there are some fruits that are sensitive to ethylene. Blueberries is going to be in the sensitive category, and it's not because blueberries will ripen quicker. It's actually because gray mold, the fungal particles of gray mold, when they are on the blueberries and exposed to ethylene, the ethylene escalates the fungal mold growth, and that can cause gray mold infections to take over your blueberries faster. I do include a slide on here about propagation for our blueberries. And this is just taking a hardwood cutting in early spring and putting that into moistened soil for you to be able to get that to root. And then you can start your own blueberry starts. Now, I will tell you that if you are doing this off of a cultivar that you have purchased, you should not do that. Especially, you should not sell those propagations as they are protected by patent law and trademark law. So this would be something for a hobbyist, or if you are trying to propagate a blueberry that has been on your property or in your family for multiple years. Next, we are going to move to brambles. And remember, brambles is that arching term that we use for blackberries and raspberries as they're in the rubus family. So our blackberries and raspberries have some common maintenance things that are maintenance practices that are common to both. So I'm going to talk about those common practices first, and then we will separate out into individual berry species. For irrigation, they both need to be watered thoroughly after planting and maintain that good soil moisture. You don't want to water them every day because they do need that good wet dry cycle. Plants should receive about 1 inch to 2 inches of either rainfall or watering each week. And this is another crop that we do recommend for drip irrigation, simply because there are some fungal issues that happen in the bramble family that can be serious. And I'm sure Grant will talk about some of those fungal issues as we get to disease. Our brambles do need trellising and pruning. So this is going to be an essential step for maintaining quality of these brambles for a long-term productivity. Proper trellising and pruning will allow you to positively influence the plant's growth rate, so they'll grow faster and develop faster. The fruit quality will be higher, the size will be larger. It will have a sweeter sugar content. By trellising and pruning, you decrease the susceptibility for disease, and it really does help with the harvesting and any weed control that you have to do. For those of you that do have brambles or have been learning about brambles, some of them are thorned varieties. And it does help by having them trellised so that you don't have to reach through that pile of potentially thorned raspberries or blackberries to harvest. So here are some examples of trellising our brambles. And I'm going to try out the annotate feature here and see if I can get it to work. So starting up here with diagram 2, this is a simple diagram of sorry, I'm trying to get my cursor to work. Here we go. So this diagram right here, which is not the right one. Right here. So this one is a 2-wire trellis. So you can see there's a wire that runs right here, and there's a wire that runs right here. Usually these trellises are the wires on the trellis are going to be set up at 3 feet and then at 5 feet. Now these trellises can be adapted to your personal height. One thing that you don't want to do is if you are somebody who might be only 5 feet tall or shorter, you don't want to be working at a trellis that might be too high for you. It's definitely no fun working above your head, and it can cause some muscle tightness and issues by working over your head if you're not used to it. So with this, let me clear these out. So this is our plant right here that has overwintered. And so one of the things that we're going to do as we prune is we are going to, and I should mention this is for thornless blackberries. When we do our dormant pruning, we're going to maintain our pruning cycle, which for brambles, they produce primocanes, which is first year wood, and we have floricanes, which are second year fruiting wood. So when we have this overwinter foliage, we need to go in and trim down to a more manageable number of canes that are going to produce our fruit that year. So this overwintered has our primary and our secondary wood. And when we prune it down, we only want our secondary floricanes. What that means is any spent wood that we have left over, anything that's diseased, will go in and prune out. We select a number of healthy canes per plant, and usually that is 4 to 6 healthy canes per plant that are going to produce us that those berries for that year. Now, our primocanes are going to develop out of the ground during the year. So those will be our vegetative canes that produce the leaves for photosynthesis. Then they'll overwinter and they will become our floricanes for next year. Down here for diagram 3, this is going to be for our red raspberries. And for our red raspberries, very similar 2-cane system, so primocanes and floricanes. So we are going to come in here and we are going to tidy this hedgerow up. So for red raspberries, they are a hedgerow type, which means they grow straight up out of the ground from the underground structures, and they fill in like you would notice with a hedgerow of boxwoods. They fill in to make that hedgerow. So if you can see the dotted lines right here, and they're a little hard to see, that is our row size. So we've got this row set at 18 to 24 inches, which is 2 feet. And anything that is outside of this 18 to 24 inches, we're automatically going to cut down to the ground. We want to keep our straight, tidy rows for our red raspberries, because if we don't, they will fill in, and pretty soon, if you have patch next to patch, those rows are going to grow together. So we'll prune out anything that's outside of the 18 to 24 inches. And the other thing we'll do is we will remove any of those diseased or dying canes. We will also take out any wood that is overgrown, and we'll again keep the same we'll keep about 6 to 8 per row of the best canes for us to get good fruiting qualities. And again, that vegetative primocane growth will come up through the year. For our black and purple raspberries, very similar to what we had to do in diagram 2. With these, we are going to keep the best 3 to 4 or 5 per plant, and we are going to remove the rest. And then the other thing that we have to do on the black and purple raspberries is these side shoots right here. These are the fruiting laterals. So these are what are produced off of those canes. And I'll highlight the cane here in the other color. So we've got the cane, and then we've got the fruiting laterals. And those fruiting laterals, we just need to come in and give them a prune so that they get tidied up, looking very similar to the bottom picture. And what's going to happen is when we do that pruning in there, we're going to regenerate that growth. We're going to compact some of that growth so that we're not producing vine-like black and purple raspberries. So we're really tightening up and stiffening that structure so that it does remain in this type of a shape. All right. And so for this diagram here, this shows a time calendar versus what I just talked about with pruning those plants. Now, the one that is different down here is the red ever-bearing raspberries. And these are also called the fall-bearing raspberries. Why they're called fall-bearing raspberries is because they grow vegetatively the first couple of months of the season, and then they produce the fruit in the fall on those first year canes. Now, why this is probably my favorite raspberry is because after you harvest all of this fruit off of there, the easiest way to prune these canes is to set your mower to the highest level and mow them off. When you mow them off, you are essentially pruning them, getting them ready for winter, and you're discarding any of that diseased foliage or those any disease that could appear on those canes. And so doing that right after harvest, they'll overwinter and start regrowing vegetatively, and the cycle repeats. You can, with the ever-bearing raspberries, you have the option to keep them over winter to get a little bit more fruit next year. The problem, well, not problem, but the thing you have to think about is that that small amount of fruit that you will get next year off those secondary canes that overwintered will maybe be a couple of cups compared to the full harvest that you will get off of those primocanes. So it's one of those things that, again, goes to your management style and you'll have to think about. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the T-trellis. This is just another type of trellis that can be used. Instead of being the full trellis with a double wire that is stacked on each other, it has 2 wires that are side by side, and you can train or tie your raspberries to each side. And you can do this to put your primocanes to one side and your floricanes to the other side. And this can be a management strategy so that you know that, okay, this year I only have to prune the left side. Next year I'll prune the right side. And so that's an ease of management strategy there. There's also the multiple wire trellis, a 4-wire trellis, and these are set about a foot apart. And this as well is just for ease of management, ease of harvest. So our black raspberries and our blackberries, they can be a little more floppier. And so this kind of a structure will help because you'll go in and you will tie at each wire to hold that plant up. So the first year, you'll want to cultivate deep enough to destroy any weeds and apply about 6 to 8 inches of mulch to the soil to help repress the weeds. Very similar to the blueberries and the strawberries, do the work ahead of time. Destroy that seed bank, keep up on your weed identification, your weed management. All right, so now we're going to get into the blackberry specific. And so for this one, we're going to fertilize each spring when growth starts, and then again just after we harvest. So you want to use a balanced fertilizer of either a 10-10-10 or a 13-13-13, whatever you can find. And you'll want to apply at about 5 pounds per 100 feet of row. So if you're only doing, in a backyard, you're only doing about 10 feet of row, you'll only use a 1/10 of the fertilizer recommendation. So you'll cut that down, which would only be 1/2 pound of fertilizer per that 10 feet of row. Years 1 and 2, you are also going to do a 12-inch circular fertilizer around each plant, and this is going to help those roots get established. By putting that circular band around there, we're going to encourage those roots to grow out to meet that fertilizer, and then that gives our plants a more well-established root system. For harvesting, again, very thin-skinned, easily damaged. You want to harvest them when the fruit color is bright, there's a little bit of gloss, and they're easily detachable. They lose their acidity while they are ripening, so if you harvest them early, they will be quite astringent. So you want to make sure that you're harvesting at the right time. And one thing that can help is just go out and do a taste test. You'll know if your raspberries taste right. If you want them sweeter, and some people actually prefer that more acidic, astringent taste to a raspberry. So this is going to come back to your management style as well. And you want to cool them to 41 degrees, which is the refrigerator temperature, within 4 hours of harvesting. One thing I do want to point out about this is, again, you don't want to store them with ethylene producing fruit. And 1 day of holding your black raspberries at or your blackberries at room temperature drastically, sorry, I had a tickle in my throat, drastically increases gray mold growth. So you do want to keep these refrigerated so that you can get up to 2 weeks of shelf stable or shelf service. Raspberries are going to be heavy feeders. They need to be fertilized. This is something you will have to do every year. You can broadcast fertilizer down the row. You will do it in spring before the growth starts, usually in May or March, excuse me, and then you'll do it again in May. You'll apply 2 to 3 pounds of a balanced fertilizer per 100 feet of row and divide that as you go. Because the raspberries are a heavy feeder, they do need that nitrogen to put into their fruit, and then they need it again to re-energize themselves for the rest of the growing season. Again, easily harvested, fragile and perishable. And for this one, my apologies, there is a typo on the screen. You want to get them as close to 32 degrees Fahrenheit within 12 hours. So putting these in the refrigerator within 12 hours. And for this one, the main thing is the raspberry should easily detach from the plant when you harvest it. It shouldn't be a tug of war. It should just be a simple pull. So 32 degrees, and for our raspberries, it's 2 to 5 days is their shelf life. They are very, very perishable. They are affected by ethylene. And so this is something that does need to go in the refrigerator quickly if you're going to use them within the next day or two, or they need to be consumed right after picking. All right, so that was a little bit longer than I wanted to go, so I apologize, Grant. The outline for today, we talked about trellising, irrigation, fertilizing, pruning, and harvesting for our berry crops. I do want to show the resources that I used. This one up at the top, USDA Handbook 66. This is the commercial guide where I got a lot of that storage information. This is a handbook that is put out by the USDA, and it is all the research on the best way to prolong shelf life and the researched temperatures for holding our fruit. And then the bottom one down here, this book, Modern Fruit Science by Childers. This is the fruit textbook that I used in college, but it has a lot of good information on there. And there are several editions of this book, and so you can get some of the older editions on some of the book resale websites if you're interested. Otherwise, the same information that's in the Childers book is also on a lot of the extension websites, and all of these links are the ones that I used in today's management strategies. So with that, if you have any questions, go ahead, and I know there are some in the chat box.
Yeah.
You can also email me those. And Grant?
Yeah, so we've got some questions, Bruce. I'm gonna share my screen and then we'll kind of talk about some of these questions.
Okay, I will stop sharing mine so that you can.
Okay, so one of the questions we had was a fertilizer with aluminum sulfate. Stacy has heard that this could lead to some aluminum toxicity in the soil. Have you heard anything about this before, Bruce?
Yes, so the fertilizer that we want to use is ammonium sulfate. Ammonium is going to give us those nitrogen compounds that we need. Aluminum sulfate is the one that you would apply to your hydrangeas to change the color. Now, unfortunately, they are side by side in most garden centers, so you really have to pay attention to the slight distinction between them. If you give aluminum sulfate to your blueberries, you will cause a aluminum toxicity.
Okay, thank you. What would you suggest for a good ground cover for weeds?
For a good ground cover for weeds, um, clovers are going to have a lot of nitrogen in them. Those can um, be quick to establish and put some of that nitrogen back in there. Any of the cover crops that are out there as a ground cover can also be used.
Ryegrass, fescues would also be good suggestions as well. You've done some work, Bruce, with growing blueberries and other fruits in containers. Are there any kind of specific suggestions for that process, or any specific cultivars or varieties?
So for our containers and fruits, um, if you were part of the container fruit program 2 weeks ago, we went over a lot of container related fruits. Um, in the last couple of years, they have been releasing more and more varieties for um, specifically designed for containers that are going to be compact and fruitful. There's the Brazzleberry series, as well as a number of cultivars that can be I'm trying to think of the distributors. Burpee website has some. Stark Brothers will have some, as well as Monrovia, I believe, is distributing some of those as well. So if you look up either Brazzleberries or those other websites for container blueberries, they only get about 3 feet tall. So they're really, really nice to have for containers.
Okay, great. So the question was, what would you use for controlling creeping Charlie? And I looked this up a little bit. You need to recognize that it's going to thrive in really moist, shady spots. So trying to eliminate that or would be helpful. Recognize that there are some post-emergence herbicides that could control them, but they may not be listed for the brambles or for blueberries or strawberries. Um, Trying to alter the space would be optimum. If this was already established, Creeping Charlie, it may be that you have to do some hand removal for the period of time. Any other suggestions you might have for that, Bruce?
That's what I was gonna say. I was gonna say I could look in the pest management guide to see if there are other local recommendations, but that that's pretty good.
What about, do mangoes produce ethylene?
That one I'm gonna have to double check. I will do that while Grant is presenting. Um, there's a list of ethylene producing fruits and ethylene sensitive fruits. I will see if I can find that and put that link in the chat box.
A question about, why does having multiple varieties of each berry type lead to higher yields?
Um, having multiple types, there is a little bit of cross-pollination that happens. And anytime that we have cross-pollination in even self-fruiting varieties, it does lead to bigger berry production.
Stacy has some wild blackberry plants and they've never been maintained. She wonders, is it possible to bring these back with care? And would there be any difference as far as their care or management that she may need to do?
Um, for the wild ones, this gets into a little bit of issue because the wild ones have a little bit more disease tolerance than some of our cultivated ones. Um, so they could, yes, they could be whipped back into shape. It will take some effort pruning them so that they are um, no more than a third. You're not pruning a more than a third of the plant a year to help it overwinter. Um, but you could um, get them back into a proper style that we talked about. The other thing to think about is if they are wildly overgrown, it might be best to cut them back to the ground and start fresh. You'll sacrifice a year of produce, but it'll give you a better starting point to prune.
Great. For red raspberry spacing in a hedgerow, what would you think would be the best spacing between plants down the hedgerow, as well as between multiple hedgerows, if they're deciding to go that route?
Um, I believe it is 6. I'm going to double check that one. I'm going to pull up my other PowerPoint just to make sure, but I think it is 6, 6 to 8 with between rows. I will double check.
That's kind of what I'm thinking is probably 6 to 12 between the hedgerows, and then probably down the hedgerow, probably 2 to 3 feet between plants, I think would be the best, but certainly look into that. A question about pruning. Do you prune back lateral branches on the main floricane on blackberries?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, you will do that. For white raspberries, and I think we're talking about yellow raspberries here. What type are they considered? Is it everbearing? Is it fall bearing?
So if I remember right, red raspberries and yellow raspberries, as well as white raspberries, are treated all the same. So you would treat them as a floricane fruiting raspberry. So that would be the grow vegetative the first year, grow the fruit the second year.
Okay. Question about drip irrigation. How would you start making drip irrigation for blueberries?
When you build your berm or your planting, you would run the irrigation tube down your planting, and you would have a nozzle right at the base of each of those plants. As for the water from your house or your pump, that plumbing would have to be put in by an irrigation specialist. Just because I never put in an irrigation system myself, so I know there are some special things that have to go into consideration about how far that pipe is in the soil.
And there can also be some home kits that, if you had a small planting area and you were hooked up to a hose that you might be able to kind of lay on the surface. I think it's going to be pretty crucial to factor in the spacing of that drip irrigation emitter because you may be running into much more of a bigger weed problem than you were hoping to have. Same with if it was buried underneath some kind of wood mulch, you might be running into some fungal issues, pest issues, and other things too. So our last question, before I kind of get into the pest section, eliminating weeds in established raspberry beds. Any kind of recommendation for that?
Eliminating weeds in established beds. Hand pulling, you're going to have to identify what weed you have in there. If you're thinking about chemical options, you have to be careful because raspberries and brambles are perennial crops. There will be some herbicides, both organic and commercial or conventional, that are going to affect your raspberries as well as those weeds. So getting that correct identification time for when the weeds are most susceptible is going to really help. And I did look up the spacing for our raspberries, and it's going to be 2 feet apart within the row and 6 to 8 feet between the rows.
Okay. And I missed one question in this round. There was a question about, can you make a man-made hill to produce blueberries? And I think you certainly could. And, that might help you when it comes to maybe weed control as well as irrigation. The only issue might be that, it might drain a little faster than maybe you want it to for the soil conditions. Any thoughts about that, Bruce?
No, that would actually work well, because essentially instead of making that berm, which would be the above ground hill that continues down the row, you would essentially be building this up into its own individual hill. So that excess water is going to run off. It can be easier to maintain those weeds, as you said. So that would be a good option.
Okay.
And
All right, so I'm going to get into the last part of today, Bruce.
okay,
So that was the last question we stopped at, was eliminating weeds and establish raspberry beds in the chat box.
okay.
Okay, so this last section then is going to be about the insects, diseases. We'll touch again on weed management, and then we're also going to get into mammals and birds, because that's a very common question we get a lot about. I also want to spend some time talking about spotted-winged Drosophila. It's a major invasive insect that we see, especially targeting our 4 berries. And it's one that we are trying to get more information out there when it comes to some of the best practices in managing spotted-winged Drosophila. The issue we're going to run into, especially from a home backyard perspective, is that sometimes when it comes to managing diseases, insects, and these others, requires troubleshooting. It may also require you to use more cultural practices, meaning that you may need to think about your spacing, consider mulch to control weeds, make sure that you're not working in wet conditions. Comparing that to maybe on a commercial scale where you might be using fungicides, herbicides, and other things. We're going to lean heavier on cultural practices that you can do with this. So Bruce has talked about a couple of these things already, but just recognize that when it comes to managing these pests, it's much easier to plan ahead and get the area set up in preparation for insects, diseases, and weed problems that you may have. Certainly getting the planting area as weed-free as possible is really crucial. You will find many more herbicides available to you to use compared to once a plant has already been established and planted. In addition, there's a number of cover crops that can be planted to help address a weed control problem, a year or 2 ahead of time. I recognize that we are kind of in a crunch, especially if you're thinking about establishing some of these fruits this season. So it may not be fully really after with that. We want you to also look at full sun area. This will not only provide a great benefit to the plants that you're going to grow, but this will also allow for the foliage to dry out and allow for it to not stay wet conditions that could lead to disease problems or allow for areas to be, allow for pests and other things to hide too. Be very mindful of any disease plants you've purchased, especially look and examine the plant material to make sure you're not introducing an infected, diseased plant or one of these plants that already has an established pest problem already. One of the things that you will also see is that you want to take into account any nearby plants and weeds. This is not only from a disease perspective where nearby weeds, shrubs, and others can harbor the same diseases that your fruit plants may have, but also for insect pressure as well. You may find that some of the insects will build up and reproduce their populations on the side before they actually move in and start wreaking havoc on strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, and so forth. Factor in weed control in rows between. That should be something to look at. And especially from a perspective of managing for mammal control, you may need to look at raised beds, fencing, and other options. It may not be that you need this in the first year, but it certainly could be something that you need to consider. I have recently planted 3 red raspberry plants, and I have noticed that the rabbit population is much more denser than I thought it was going to be. And while they are going after my Swiss chard transplants right now, I am deeply concerned as to what the red raspberries will look like as they start to leaf out. A number of these good cultural practices you see here is really what we're after. And these can really help when it comes to disease control, weed control, insect control, and potentially mammal control as well. Having the proper pruning and making sure that you don't leave any diseased canes behind on raspberries will ensure that disease does not overwinter into the next year. Having that proper spacing between plants is very crucial so that the foliage can also dry out. Sometimes if our soil pH is incorrect for our blueberry plants, it can make them much more vulnerable for insect and disease pressure. They may not be able to bounce back from having some kind of attack, if you will. Look also towards irrigation management if that's what you're after. As we've talked some about drip irrigation, this is one advantage, is that it is getting water right at the base of the plant compared to getting the foliage all wet. And if you were to water your plants, try to always water at the base of the plants as much as you can, and do it at the start of the day or in the middle of the afternoon so that the foliage can dry out. Mulching is also going to be pretty crucial for a lot of this group, and I think it's something that you'll see a lot of advantages to from a soil perspective, as well as from a disease and insect perspective too. The only issue is that it can sometimes be a balancing act where mulching can allow for mammals and insects to hide, but it can also provide some really good benefits to your plants as well. One of the other steps that you need to just go ahead and start adopting is removal of overripe berries during the growing season. You will find time and time again when it comes to managing insects in the backyard, in your berry patch, the one recommendation mentioned for almost every single one is removal of overripe berries during the growing season. This can really help you when it comes to having those good fresh berries that you're really after and that you really want, is removing the overripe ones so that insect pressure will not become a problem. So let's get into disease management then. I'm going to try to profile a number of them out there. Know that these come infrequently. I find that I will see disease pressure a lot on strawberry, but I do not always see it, say, on blueberry or raspberries plants. We see it kind of infrequently, if you will. It's always important to have that proper diagnosis for disease management. So this growing season, or even now, if you start to maybe suspect you may have a disease problem, we really want you to have a proper diagnosis. And it could be that you send us photos, Bruce or myself or others, or you deliver it to our Master Gardener hotline and their email address. But making sure you have that proper diagnosis before you determine if you need to apply some fungicide or if there's no way that it would even be helpful or beneficial at this point. Having those good cultural practices in place is also what you're after, pruning properly, making sure spacing is good and having good airflow, removing any of the canes from the previous season that have yielded so that they will not provide habitats or areas to harbor it. Know that there's going to be some fungicide options, and these are both organic and non-organic. Organic is what you see here, this OMRI, which stands for Organic Materials Review Institute. Like I shared with you, you may see these irregular. You will find that a lot of times removal of disease, canes, and leaves may be the best helpful strategy at this point. Because you are producing sometimes just an annual cane or a cane that will live for 2 years, you may find that pruning that out could be the best strategy. with it. Recognize too that winter damage can sometimes look similar to disease problems. We see this pretty frequently, especially in the last couple of years where we've had such severe winters up in northern Illinois that sometimes it's winter damage and it's not disease. So some strawberry diseases to mention here. You're going to see for some of them effects might be fruits, leaves, the stolon, and the roots. The cultural controls is what you're after, remediating these beds, allowing for good airflow, kind of making sure that you're not working in wet conditions to help with this. The main four we'll get into more on the next couple of slides, what you see here, anthracnose, angular leaf spot, gray mold, powdery mildew. In this photo over here on the left, this is a kind of a common spot of strawberry, on strawberry. This is fairly cosmetic. There really isn't much concern as far as having a fungicide or so forth. But certainly some of these diseases can look similar, and it's really important to have that proper diagnosis to recognize whether or not you need to do some sort of action when it comes to them. Anthracnose is in this photo, so it's kind of this brownish, blackish mold that's on the fruit as it's developing. You may also see it on the leaf tissue, so you see these kind of pretty dominant brown leaves underneath the fruit. It's spread with water. It's spread also with humid weather where it's really most active. And you may see the infection is actually on the roots of the strawberries, as well as kind of the black runners going from them. Some of the main recommendations are avoid working in wet conditions and making sure that you have good airflow. So making sure the spacing is correct, and perhaps making sure that you've just got areas where this just can't create more humid conditions. Angular leaf spot is on the other side of the leaves, and we see it a lot on the leaves veins, water-soaked lesions on the lower leaves. If you took a cutting of one of the leaves, you would actually see this gross bacterial ooze on the underside of the leaf. So it is more of that bacterial condition than it is a fungal issue. But certainly dead leaves from the previous season could have this. Any water, any wetness could allow for this too. Some of the cultural controls will be kind of the removal of dead leaves from the previous season, kind of limiting the water. That wet foliage is really what you're after. Gray mold is going to be very known. I don't think you're going to doubt whether you have gray mold or not. It's going to be this blackish, brownish, grayish mold on the fruit as it's developing. And you'll notice sometimes with some of these diseases that it is on the fruit sometimes is where it develops. It isn't always developing on the leaves just yet, but you may see it on both of them. This is one where it is spread by wind, and so that can be sometimes a challenge when it comes to actually controlling these diseases, is that it's moving by wind, and perhaps because it's staying wet, some of the strawberry plants are, it could be spread that way. Human activity could also do it if you're working in those wet conditions. So be very mindful of it. You'll see very small yellow tan spots, and they can almost just cover the entire leaves, but you'll have that gray velvety growth on the strawberry. And that can be a very strong contender that you've got some gray mold issues happening here. Good airflow is what you're after. Yet again, think about limiting water, working in wet conditions. Be very mindful of that. Can help quite a bit with this. Strawberries also have some powdery mildew issues. I think because of the timing of our cucurbits and growing cucumber, squash, and other cucurbit family members, you may not see much of this in northern Illinois. This may be more of a condition in central as well as southern Illinois, but recognize that you can sometimes have this infection. And you may see it on the underside of the leaves here. It could lead to deformed fruits and so forth. Yet again, good airflow, making sure that you're in an area where you're having good airflow, good wind control, as well as spacing. You may find it comes in later in the season, so maybe it doesn't affect you as much. For blueberry diseases, this does include anthracnose. It includes a lot of different blights, Phytophthora root rot is one I'll show you photos of, but recognize that it could be winter damage instead. The photo you see here on blueberry is winter damage, and it's coming in a little bit later than we fully expect. And I think that's what you may find with some of the brambles as well as blueberries, is that it could be more winter damage than others. Recognize that you want to check the soil pH. Your soil pH could be out of whack, and that could be making your blueberry plants more prone to some of these diseases. Also look towards nutrient issues. You may find that you have some nitrogen issues, and this could be making them much more prone to this. So you'll see for these blights, dieback of twigs would be pretty common on your plants. It wouldn't necessarily look like a nutrient issue, but it could be that the lack of pH being where it needs to be is making these plants more vulnerable. But the dieback would be a very common thing. Depending on what this disease was, the common practice may be to actually prune out part of this plant. That might be what that strategy is. But you may see this in the middle of the summer, though. It may not be something that you immediately see in spring or in late May. But one of the main recommendations would be to make sure the pH is correct and keeping those in line. And that could help address most of your blights in this situation. Phytophthora root rot is going to be much more different. You will see in this photo from University of Kentucky that it is very common in sometimes poorly drained soils where this fungus exists. And so it basically takes down this entire plant. Really what the main recommendation is if this was occurring would be to remove that entire plant. That would be your main suggestion here. And this would be one that the whole plant would just be brownish, blackish, died at this point, beginning to die at this point. And removal of that should keep it from spreading to the rest of that line. But sometimes it has to be pretty careful with it though. You see this root rot occasionally in peppers as well. I've not seen it in Northern Illinois just yet. And you may see it more in Central as well as Southern. For your bramble diseases, it's going to be cane blight and spur blight. Both blights will show on primocanes, and it's going to be first in late summer, early fall. So this is one where you want to watch your diseases this upcoming fall on your primocanes, all of that new growth of 2020, because they could develop it. Blights tend to be worsened with improper pruning as well. So if you are leaving behind some kind of cane, or some part of the cane, perhaps this could be leading to it. The cane blight is what you see here. It's kind of brownish. It's very much almost like reptilian skin, if you will, almost kind of crackly to it. You see it a little, sometimes pretty often, and you can see the difference between the cane blight and the spur blight. The spur blight is going to be a black infection, and it's going to be where the actual leaves touch the main stem, main cane of the plant. That's going to be your main difference here. In most cases, the recommendation is to remove those canes. Removing them is going to be the easiest way to address this problem. But certainly look towards those infections in the fall, and that would be a good strategy to help you address it, because they could be overwintering into that next year, the cane blight as well as the spur blight. For blackberry diseases, recognize yet again our friend anthracnose keeps showing up. So it's going to keep happening, and anthracnose also impacts tomatoes, although I think it's a different cultivar or variety that does it. Cane blight, you're going to have similar symptoms as raspberries. Spur blight does not affect blackberries. So recognize that you're just potentially dealing with cane blight of that. And then orange rust is kind of a newer one in this category that you'll see on blackberries. And as its name suggests, orange rust is going to be a main giveaway. You're going to very much know that you have orange rust. But recognize it's not going to hit red raspberries. Purple and black raspberries would be the ones that are susceptible along with your blackberries with it. There is some resistance of blackberry cultivars, and the odd thing about this is it's based on your geographical location of where you're growing them. Um, the symptoms tend to be, as you see here in this photo, with kind of the orange leaves. The leaves will weather, they'll drop later in the season. They may appear normal later on, but show up with symptoms the next year. So, you know, just recognize that the blackberries may run into this situation. And it could be something where, yet again, just making sure that you're pruning properly. You may find that the infection is pretty severe, that you need to prune out a couple of those canes that have that infection. But certainly recognize it's more of a blackberry issue than others. We see some cultivation of blackberry on a commercial scale up in northern Illinois, but not as frequently as we do in parts of central and southern Illinois. Bruce mentioned a lot about weed control, so I'm not really going to spend much time here, but just recognize that your chemical options are very few and far between before you get started. As you get growing, you know, starting off strong can really help with this. I want to highlight a number of insects. I recognize that there are a lot of insects out there, but just want to mention a couple of these as well as some general ones. With strawberries, we see tarnished plant bug, which is the one that you see here. A lot of them really like to hide in leaf litter. And so it's really important to make sure that, yes, a mulch would be great to address a lot of your production practices, but also recognize that the mulch could be hiding and allowing for some of these insects to really thrive. Removing weeds nearby is also crucial. And then also renovating that patch on a seasonal basis could help quite a bit. Blueberries, leaf roller is the one that you see here. Pruning and weed control can help quite a bit when it comes to blueberry, especially the leaf roller damage. Weed control as well as some pesticides. We're going to revisit Japanese beetles in a couple slides, so give me some patience here. Raspberries and blackberries, now we have cane borers. And the cane borers will be very noticeable because the cane will be basically deflated. The other thing that you're going to run into with raspberries and blackberries much more is going to be picnic beetles or sap beetles, which is what you see here. And they will be very much on all over your fruit sometimes. The best strategy is sanitation, you know, removing any of the gross fruit that has been deposited on the ground is what you're after. Consider harvesting much more regularly. If it was a wilted cane that had been damaged from the borers, then you want to remove that cane. There can be some traps, but just recognize that the traps may not do you much good in that situation. You may not see the actual cane borer itself, but you may see the actual damage. And it would be that the cane is deflated, it's brown, it could be cracked, it could look a little bit similar to some of our blights. However, if you were to remove that cane and slice it down the middle, you would actually see where it had kind of moved through that actual cane with it. Usually removal of that one single cane can be enough for it. It can be very hard to control this insect because it is a flying insect. A netting might be what you're after here, or providing a much better mulch area to keep them from getting to those canes could be a solution. For Japanese beetles, our main suggestion is going to be hand picking. This should be done in early morning, soapy water in a bucket. Shaking them into the bucket is what you're after, so then they'll drown. We do not recommend a Japanese beetle trap because they will tend to attract way more Japanese beetles than you have ever had in your growing area. So we do not recommend them for that reason. There are chemical control options, but just know that they can sometimes have high toxicity to bees and other pollinators. Nemo, spinosyn are organic solutions, and they may still have a little bit of toxicity to pollinators as well. There are soil solutions such as BT as well as milky spore. They are not consistent when it comes to controlling Japanese beetle grubs when they're applied to the soil. You may have success, but recognize that you may not have as much success as you'd like. Netting could also be a solution to put on over your raspberries, strawberries, and others to help to control them. But recognize that the main one is probably going to be hand picking and shaking into a soapy bucket of water for them to drown. Our invasive insect is spotted-winged Drosophila, and so it's a very small fruit fly, and the female will lay eggs into the fruit as it is ripening. You see the female here at the side and the male on the left side. The male is typically what we see more and more, and we see that kind of in some of the traps where you'll see these two bands on the foreleg. The main concern with spotted-winged Drosophila is that there are a number of fruit that is affected by it. And it basically includes almost everything that we've talked about today. My strawberries, my raspberries, blueberries, and blackberries should be listed under there. You actually see in these gross photos, which is what we like to show you before lunch, the eggs and the larva that is developing. So it is that you have picked the berries, you've brought them indoors, and now that they are maybe hatching on your kitchen counter or sometimes in the refrigerator even. But they tend to target almost every one of the berries that we've talked about today. And you see the adults here. You may not see these on your ripening fruit. It could actually be that they've just laid the eggs and then you're harvesting the fruit and then that's where the eggs hatch. There is a monitoring trap, so recognize that this is not a trap that will trap them. This is a trap that will help you realize that you have spotted-winged Drosophila. There is also a recommendation to use a fine netting, one that is very hard for these insects to get into. That can be a really good solution when it comes to it. When it comes to some of the berries. Of course, recognize if you're using this, you may actually be keeping some of the pollinators from getting to the fruit. Know that this a lot of times from a homeowner perspective is to tolerate but remediate. Freezing berries could be a solution to just eat the berries, knowing full well you're probably getting some protein. You could pick the bad berries, place them in a plastic bag, and leave them out in the sun. So letting them actually kind of cook, if you will, these bad berries. But removing bad berries is what you're after. And these should not be composted, nor should they be buried. The actual fly will survive both of these conditions. So the recommendation is to throw away bad berries during the summer. So you see a little bit of what, a sticky yellow trap shows. You've got a bit of the adults here, especially with the male in this photo. So I have this trap out, it shows that I have this, and now I need to do something about it. So it could be that now I recognize I need to just make sure that I am destroying all of the bad berries off of the plants as I'm picking them. Birds is a great question we get a lot about because birds tend to really like this berry group, especially our brambles and potentially even our blueberries and strawberries. Netting can sometimes be the main recommendation, and yet again, it really depends on what your bird population is when it comes to this. There is also chemical repellents. So there is a grape Kool-Aid method where you are actually mixing 4 packets of unsweetened grape Kool-Aid in 1 gallon of water, and you're applying this onto the berries before they ripen. This is a bittering agent. It is not killing the birds. It is just a bittering agent. And so it is making it very, they do not like it, is what you're after. You could also do sugar water. You could take 5 pounds of sugar in 2 quarts of water, and you could apply this onto the berries as they're ripening. Of course, that's going to attract a lot more other insect pests than what you are not after. I have resources at the end that can give you more information on both of these recommendations because they both come from University Extension Services. Scare devices could also be combined with these. I think that's what you're going to be really after is combining them. Also look towards site selection, making sure you're not in an area where these bird populations could build up and just hang out. Recognize that they could become tolerant over time to a lot of your methods. And so you may have to combine them with many different other ones. For mammals, recognize that this could be adapted in the growing area. You know, we think about squirrels, chipmunks, deer, rabbit, some of those other mammals out there. And a raised bed might be an okay solution for some of them, especially if you combine it with a netting or combined it with a barrier or a fence. You may find that netting is another area with it too. Some recommendations for squirrel management is to set up a decoy area. So actually have an area very far away from your growing area where you're feeding them. I don't know if that's the best recommendation when it comes to it, but it could be something that to use. If you are feeding birds, recognize that any of that debris that's coming from bird seed at the base of that bird feeder could also be allowing for mammals to increase in population. Try to clean up debris area, hiding areas. There are chemical repellents. Some of them, especially for deer, can work pretty well. One of the most common ones is called Buck Off, Buckoff, and it is made with some egg solids and vinegar, and it's applied once every 30 days, but it has to be applied pretty frequently to any new growth. So it can be a mix of these is the best strategy, but recognize that they will maybe get used to it. So there are some resources for you. I added another one this morning called Bird Protection for Blueberries, which goes into some of the great Kool-Aid recommendations for managing the birds. I like University of Minnesota's guides as well as Wisconsin and other ones. So I rushed through that, I recognize that, but I know that we had a lot of good questions and I wanted us to just have a little bit of time so we could still keep answering some of them.
All right, great. Thanks, Grant. We do have some questions. While we do questions, I am going to launch our poll, which is what berries are you now wanting to grow? So now that Grant, Candace, and I have given you all the information, are you still interested in growing berries? We want to know. Hopefully, after some of Grant's pictures, we didn't dissuade you. With that, while you guys are answering, I'm going to give Grant his first question. And this comes from AJ. With such a mild winter that we just had, should we be aware of any insect or disease that might be more prevalent this year from the lack of die-off of not having those killing freezes?
Yeah, I mean, most of your blights, you know, if you had, say, if you had some disease that showed up last fall and you were unaware of it, it most likely has overwintered this spring. So I think now might be a pretty good time to actually do some observations with your canes as they are starting to grow and with some of your other plants. Just because we've not had such a mildness, we should kind of expect things to be normal or maybe even a little bit worse than usual.
All right. And next question. How good are commercially available pH soil test kits for something like blueberries?
So they can be okay. What I tend to recommend is, you know, if that's the route you want to go, send off a soil sample to a lab first, and then from there, use it as a comparison tool. You know, when you're sending a soil sample off to a lab, you are getting many more results run, and that gives you a much better comparison with it. So that would be my strategy if that was what you're going to do. And know that some of the soil test labs are turning around pretty quickly, about 1 and 2 weeks. I just got a soil test last week that came back. So the results can vary. I will say that I did pick up one of those kind of barometers where you stick it into the ground and then you measure the soil pH. Some companies have them. And I did it in the same area where I had gotten my soil test results, and it was wildly off when it came to that. So I lean heavier on a home kit that has you mixing some chemicals, if you will.
Okay. Next question. Does orange rust on hollyhocks affect our berries?
That's a good question. I think it probably will have some overlap with it. So I think it's something, if you had seen previously some symptoms of that on your hollyhocks, you may be a little more vigilant when it comes to what might be on the blackberries. So I would imagine there's probably going to be some overlap there.
And Grant, I did look this one up because I wasn't sure, and they're actually 3 different funguses.
Okay.
So the one that affects hollyhocks is different from the 2 that affect our berry species.
Gotcha. Oh, good to know. Yeah, and we see that sometimes, is that they can be very different. So.
All right. Bernie says, I get very tiny worms in my raspberries. Please help. Any idea what those tiny worms might be?
Yeah, I mean, if it's not the larva one, the spotted-winged Drosophila, to me, I would try to see if you could do some kind of netting or some kind of row cover once you've gotten some pollination happening, because you've probably got some flying insects that are moving in, and it's going to be very hard to control those with any kind of pesticide. I'd also try to make sure that you're keeping the area underneath your plants clean from any kind of depositing bad berries. Any bad berries falling down would be another strategy. But if it's covering all of them, you may need to invest in some kind of netting or some kind of row cover.
All right. Andy asks, why pick Japanese beetles in the early AM? I've always found that they're more active in the warmer part of the day.
It tends to be, especially in the morning, they're a little bit more stunned when it comes to actually falling into the soapy bucket. So that tends to be what the recommendation is that they're a little bit slower moving when it comes to, depositing them into that soapy bucket of water. But as I talk to a lot of people, every backyard's always a little bit different. So you may be seeing more trend differently, though.
All right. This question is one that we always get a lot with spotted wing Drosophila. So how can I tell which berries have been affected by spotted wing before I pick them?
You really can't tell. The female has such a small ovipositor when it comes to actually laying the fruit, the larva in there, that it's very hard to tell with the naked eye. Even examining each berry, you're really not going to see that. And so what folks will do is they'll pick them, then lay them on the counter or have them in the refrigerator for a little bit of time. And that's when the actual emerges for a couple of days. But there's no sure sign. That's why a trap is used, so that it says, okay, the males are here, so I need to address it.
Perfect. All right. Next one is, are there any special considerations or differences for an urban environment? I live in Chicago and have some berries in the ground next to my townhome, and I have some containers on the roof.
I think that you will find, depending on where you're located, you might be in a situation where you have good airflow. I'm kind of thinking about kind of the where your physical location might be, and that could help when it comes to some of your disease problems or potential disease problems that we worry about. Yeah, it's kind of hard to think. Yeah, it's hard to know sometimes if there's much differences that you might see. What are your thoughts with this question, Bruce?
I'm on the same kind of track that you are, that it's going to come down to your microclimate. Is there enough airflow to limit some of those diseases? Is there enough sunlight to allow for the soil to thoroughly drain out? The other thing to kind of think about is if it's a no for the airflow question, you may have to prune to open up your your berries a little bit more, just so that you increase that airflow, just in case you have it on a side that may have more windbreaks associated with it. And I'm not sure who asked the question, but if you want Grant or I to take a look at where you have them planted, just take a snapshot of where you have them and email it to either Grant, myself, or both of us, and we can take a closer look at that for you.
And when you look at some of these disease issues, for instance, on the scale, we see more strawberry disease issues in Northern Illinois than we do brambles and blueberries and others. I've seen cane blight once in 7 years, whereas we see strawberry disease very frequent every season.
All right, next question we've got, any solutions for picnic bugs? They destroyed my blackberries last year before they got ripe enough to harvest.
Yeah, so certainly remediate, kind of make sure that you don't have any hiding areas for them. I would also look towards a row cover once you've gotten some pollination to keep those picnic sap beetles from being a problem. But you're going to find that keeping them from getting to the berries and creating a barrier might be what you're after.
Perfect. Question about the bird protection for blueberries publication. Who publishes that? And then how many packets of Kool-Aid was it per gallon?
Yeah, so it comes from University of Massachusetts Extension. It's a pretty nice document that goes into it. And they have it as 4 packets of grape Kool-Aid and 1 gallon of water. And you just want to apply this as the berries begin to color. I think, as I understand it, you're trying to get the bird, you may lose some berries at the beginning because the birds are going to go to the berries, but they're going to have that bittering taste and then they're going to learn to not go to the berries. And that's why you're doing it before they actually ripen, is that color. It's a compound called methyl anthranilate. It's the same compound that's found in Concord grapes. And you will also find that compound used in other bird deterrent bittering agents too.
Perfect. Can I grow blueberries in containers? And I think we've talked about this a little bit. Yes, you can grow, or blackberries, excuse me. Can I grow blackberries in containers? Yes. Over the past couple of years, there have been some blackberries, raspberries, and blueberries released at local garden centers that are designed or bred to be grown in containers. They only get about 2 feet above the pot size. They flower and they have a compact habit. So they've been really bred to be patio plants. One of those series is the Raspberry series, which are widely available. Next question that came in, how soon will part 1 and this section, part 2, be posted to YouTube? So part 1 is being closed captioned right now. Member of our staff is working on it. I'm hoping to have part 1 uploaded to YouTube by the end of the week. And part 2, it should take about another week. So I'm hoping to have part 2 uploaded by next Friday. 2 more questions that I've seen. I'm interested in blackberries. I have them for 2 years. First year was great, but some were tart, and last year, very limited harvest. Any ideas?
If you're in Northern Illinois, blackberries may need some winter protection. I think that that's where a lot of folks are shifting towards, is to provide winter protection. And this could be a very heavy duty row cover that you put down on top of the blackberry canes for survivability, as well as for the overall health of the plants. Um, so that's where a lot of folks are shifting towards when it comes to them. As far as the flavor of something being a little bit tart, to me, it's usually something environmentally based. So it could be, when you harvested them or the age of the cane, the common very wet Junes that we are getting, along with some of those later spring temperatures, could be impacting the plant for that season. What is your additional thoughts, Bruce?
Um, the only other thing that I was thinking of, besides the environmental, um, could be just if you harvested maybe a week too early. The other issue could be fertilization, and if they haven't been pruned, that could also go into that sugar content production. So I would check with how you're doing on your pruning. Be sure that you're doing the annual fertilization, and then do the taste test to get your harvest times right. And then last question that we've got is, do you have a great source for large, very fine mesh netting? I'm assuming it's probably for birds.
Yeah, so I would start with some of the online companies like Gemplers or Gurneys, or some of those that are probably selling a lot of garden supplies right now. You may also find kind of Greenhouse Supply Company, I believe, is another one that people have purchased some items before. These are just these are not necessarily recommendations. These are just those that are out there. So just recognize we're not endorsing one company over another, but you'll find them pretty frequently online. And for, say, summer protection for row covers or netting, you'll want to make sure that you're getting about 95% light penetration, especially in a row cover. Versus if it's winter cover, winter row cover protection, that'd be a little different. Any additional ideas, Bruce?
The only other place that I was thinking of is I've had good luck at the local farm supply stores.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's a product that you are looking for, like the fine mesh netting, um, ask one of the members of the farm store leadership, and sometimes they can work with other stores or their suppliers to get you those materials that you need. I've had good luck doing that with some of our children's gardens, and it's worked out really well. Um, that was the last question that I've seen in the chat box. I will save the chat box and go through it again just to make sure we didn't miss anything. I thank you all for joining us today, and I appreciate you sticking around the extra 20 minutes while we answered questions. Because as I've been watching the chat box, a lot of people are finding the chat box questions really valuable for a lot of things that they had themselves been thinking about. So we do really appreciate those questions, and Grant and I do enjoy taking the questions and spending that extra time with you. So thank you all for joining us. Grant, thank you so much for participating today and presenting. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Bruce.
And next week, for those that are registered or those that are interested, we are finishing up the Growing Horticulture in Northwest Illinois webinar series with colorful vegetables. So please join us for colorful vegetables next week. And then we will look at putting together another continuation for the Growing Horticulture in Northwest Illinois as we get closer to summer. So thank you all. I appreciate it and have a great day. Do